you so much, Andy. I'm also very honored to be your guest, I guess. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you on my part of our project, the project that we're working on together here in Cologne this semester. And the exclusive flows is kind of a play on words a bit, because I will also talk about transnational flows, or I will question transnational flows in the context of tourism, but I will also talk about yoga, where you're also very much concerned with flows. So yeah, we'll see. I'll go into that in a second. So the general question that I want to address in this talk is how social spaces, both offline and online, in Zanzibar are created communicatively, so via communicative practices, but also discursively, so discourses around tourism and around certain spaces in Zanzibar. And then also looking at how accessible these different spaces are for different people. Right. And one thing that I should mention, now seeing this quote, the quote is also included in my abstract, but the abstract, I'm not sure that I'll really talk to all the points that I made in the abstract, you know, how it sometimes goes with abstract writing, you write it and then while working on the presentation, it turns out to be something a little different. So this might be a little different from the abstract, but at least the quote is here, because I think it's still very fitting, because it very much emphasizes the importance of space in our contemporary world. And it also hints at a spatial concept that I'd like to discuss, heterotopias, but I'll go into that in more detail in a second as well. So this is kind of the agenda for today. I have 4 main points that I want to discuss. I'll give you some theory. So those are the first 2 points here, and then the third one is the empirical part. So I talked to Erik and Lasha last week, and we talked about, okay, who works with theory and who works with empirical data, and I kind of work with both, I'd like to think. So I'm giving you both. And then as a conclusion, I would like to somehow link my data to the concept of heterotopias as suggested by Foucault. Right. And this picture here, I was looking for a picture to kind of symbolize space or place or something, so I googled place, and this is one of the pictures that comes up. It's 21 places in the world that are worth visiting according to Forbes, and it's an interesting selection. Apparently, or they say, it's organized according to tropical and warm places, Arctic and cold places, and architectural places. Yeah, which I find interesting. So there's no architecture in cold places or no architecture in warm places. I find that distinction a bit weird. But yeah, and also to me, not all of these are actually places, and I hope you'll understand what I mean when I discuss what I mean by place and space in a second. Because this here, for example, is the Northern Lights in Iceland, which to me is not, the Northern Lights are not a place to me, I'd say. Yeah. But what do I mean by space and place? For me, those are kind of opposing, or not really opposing, but different concepts that are somehow linked, with place being a key concept in meaning making, meaning that it's also cross-linguistically in most languages of the world, or some people have argued in all languages of the world, there is a word for place, or meaning place, or where, or something like that. So it's lexicalized across all languages. It's a so-called semantic prime, some people have argued, so Lewis and Cipula. And they also argue that it's been a bit neglected in favor of space in Western philosophy. While on the other hand, we have space, which is a bit more abstract as a concept. The idea is a bit more hard to translate. It might have counterparts in different European languages, but not in all languages of the world. So not cross-linguistically. And in general, also Levison and Sippola argue that there are lots of complex terminologies like localities, spatialities, and so on, of which we have a lot in academic language and academic jargon. But even those abstractions usually are linked to space, or they are somehow explained by mentioning place as well. And in linguistics, Liebscher and Delio-Kane argue that space does not necessarily have a geographical location, but it is constructed by bottom-up processes of people interacting in occupied space. So to put that in a nutshell, space is practiced place. So space is rather a social concept, not necessarily a geographical one, while place is. And space is constructed socially via interaction and effectively constructed, basically. And maybe one thing that I should say is that there is a lot of literature on space and place, and that people use these concepts differently and define them differently. This is just my working definition. So yeah, let me know if you think it doesn't work, but I think for my work, it does work. And now turning to a concept that is kind of a spatial concept and related to the things that I just said, relating to space, which has a long history in Western experience, so the concept itself, where in the Middle Ages there were usually dichotomies of different types of places, so and also hierarchically ordered. So sacred versus profane places, protected versus open spaces, and so on. Galileo then introduced a more infinitely open space idea. And then Foucault goes on to say that in our contemporary times, in our epoch, space is a lot about relations between different spaces. So the main defining feature here is interlinkage, if you will. And he proposes that there are two types of spaces, of interlinked spaces, that are somehow linked to all other spaces and places, but that also contradict them. So on the one hand, utopias, which you probably know about or have heard about, so basically idealized places or spaces. He says sites with no real place. They present society itself in a perfected form, but in any case, utopias are fundamentally unreal places. But I'm a bit more interested in heterotopias, and I've discussed them with Angie already, who maybe doesn't think that the concept really applies to her places that she's working on. But I still wanted to discuss the notion with regard to my own data. So heterotopias are defined by Foucault as places outside of all places, but they have some kind of link to reality because they are counter sites, and they contest and invert real places in a way. Okay, so much for all the spaces and places and differences between them. Now, how does that relate to language and discourse? basically, very simply put, linguistic practices meaning your accent, your choice of words, different dialects, and so on, also are important and meaningful in creating spaces, social spaces, and especially then sociolinguistic spaces are often indexically linked to places. And both online and offline spaces are an integral part of how communication and social arrangements are negotiated. So we basically negotiate space via language in different ways. So by using a particular, for example, a particular language that nobody else understands in a certain space, you can make the space exclusive or inclusive. You can deliberately include people or exclude people, and so on. That's kind of the idea here. And then online, all these discursive practices also help to disseminate space in a way. In modern sociolinguistics, and I consider myself to be a sociolinguist, we are kind of trying to dissociate speakers and places. So that's a bit like the traditional way of doing things, of analyzing language. So if you speak language in a certain way, if you speak a certain dialect, accent, or whatever, then you are from a certain place. You can tell that you're from a certain place because you use a certain regional accent. But in our day and age, I'd say, with lots of mobility, migration, and so on, the way you speak does not necessarily say something about where you're from, for example. So what we're a bit more interested in is really space, so social space, and how language helps construct that. Okay. Now, tourism is besides space, kind of the other notion that my talk is centered around. So I want to briefly say something about tourism and discourse, or tourism discourse. In general, tourism has been argued to be a key identity source for members of late modern societies, meaning that everyone, so this is how Thurlow and Newosky understand it, everyone at some point in their lives gets in touch with tourism in one way or another, either being a tourist or living in a destination that is visited by someone who is a tourist. And I'm not sure that this is actually the case for each and everyone in the world, but I think the gist of it is kind of true, that we are somehow affected by tourism, usually in one way or another. The way that I approach tourism and tourism discourse as well is a critical approach, and we've heard a lot about critical theory. We heard a lot about that by Rosi Braidotti last week as well, so I'm not going to go into very much detail with that, but just with regard to tourism, that means that tourism is studied as a major cultural industry, which aims at, and the approach aims at demonstrating the role of tourism in establishing ideologies and relations of often unequal power around the world. So we basically want to point out where things are out of balance socially. And tourism discourse then is kind of my main object of analysis, so the thing that I want to analyze. And it has been defined as language and communication in tourism as global cultural industry. It is inherently multimodal, so it's not only about what people say or what people write, but it's also about pictures and other semiotic means that are very much meaningful in these contexts. And as such, then, tourism discourse contributes to the creation of the tourist space as a social space. So basically, my conceptualization of discourse is very broad. I understand it, according to Foucault, as a moment of the social, which includes language, other semiotic forms and systems, and relates them to each other. And finally, a few facts and figures about tourism in Zanzibar before I actually show you my data and analyze some of it. Zanzibar is not, and I don't know if everybody knows where Zanzibar is. I'm going to show you a map, but it's part of Tanzania, so it's the Zan in Tanzania. It's an archipelago off the coast of Tanzania, so in Eastern Africa, and it consists of a couple of islands. The largest one being where most of the tourism is, basically. So an archipelago, islands. That is also why it's not one of the most popular tourist destination in Africa, because most tourism to Africa, most tourists want to go on safari, and you can't go on safari in Zanzibar. However, it is relatively popular because it has benefited from the general popularity of island tourism worldwide. And especially since the 1990s, tourism numbers have sharply increased. It has been, the World Bank 2022 says it's the largest economic sector of the archipelago, accounting for 27% of the GDP and creating 60,000 jobs. That was before the pandemic. So those are numbers from 2019, and there was a big change, as you can imagine, with people not traveling. So a lot of things did change during and after the pandemic, but they're kind of back on track to achieving the same numbers as before. Before the pandemic, the annual growth rate of that sector was 16%, so quite a bit. But also there's been a huge increase in rural poverty because of the pandemic. So yeah, it has really had an impact on the local economy. Okay, this is the map that I promised. It's a map of, so you don't see Tanzania here. It's just what you can see here is mainly the main island, so Unguja Island or Zanzibar Island. Most people will not know it as Unguja. And then you see little circles. This is where I collected my data. So here in Zanzibar City or Stone Town, this is basically where most people will go through at some point during their journey, because that's also where the airport is. So yeah, they will come through here. It has a UNESCO, or Stone Town itself is a UNESCO heritage site, so that's also why lots of people will visit it. I collected data in Juni on the north coast, so that is mostly beach tourism, I'd say. So lots of people who just want to, enjoy the sun and beach. Paje and also Jambiani, which is not on the map, on the east coast is similar-ish, but there's a bit more, I'd say, more active tourists there, because there's a lot of kite surfing and sports and those kinds of things. So that's why I went to these 3 different locations, because I think you meet very different types, and I know you meet different types of tourists there. And also, I remembered one question by Anja Lemke when we did the introductory round, who asked, so how do you collect your data, or where do you get your data from? So this is an overview of the data that I collected since 2017. So in general, I apply an ethnographic approach, meaning that I'm aiming at thick descriptions, as they have been called. So I want to go into a bit more detail with fewer participants than quantitative approaches that aim at collecting lots of data. And I've applied different methods themselves. So I've done interviews with local Zanzibaris, 13 of them, and I've distributed questionnaires among tourists. I'm collecting observations and field notes. Those are a bit difficult to quantify. I can't say how many, a couple of booklets. I collected so-called Q methodological data, and the Q method is a psychological method aimed at finding out about attitudes and motivations among people for doing things, basically, to put it in a nutshell. And then this is kind of where COVID happened, because then I turned to collecting digital data because I couldn't go there anymore. But that also proved very interesting, and now kind of comparing these two types of data is actually very interesting and insightful. So I played around with a couple of digital humanities methods, and I collected a social media corpus from Instagram automatically. A couple of hundred posts between 2019 and 2020. And then, and this is also what I'm going to talk about today, so what I call a website corpus, I looked at advertisements of yoga retreats in Zanzibar. So the text of the advertisements, but also the pictures. Right, now I would like to look at the offline tourist space first. And this is kind of the linguistic repertoire that I compiled based on what people told me what languages they speak, but then also based on what languages they said they speak in the tourist space, basically. So as you can see, this is a very multilingual, very diverse space. Lots of languages, European languages, Asian languages, African languages, obviously. English is highlighted because it's the one language that everybody told me they use in tourism. And that's why I would call English here a so-called multilingua franca. So it's one of many possible language choices in a linguistically diverse space, but yeah, here it's definitely the lingua franca that is used by everyone. One thing that I would also like to point out is Kiswahili here, which is the local language in Zanzibar, and it's also, an official language in Tanzania, but not many of the tourists actually told me they spoke it. So most of them will use English. Also, one thing that needs to be mentioned is this is not based on tests with tourists on how much Russian they actually speak. So if they told me I speak Russian, then I included this here. So I let participants kind of define their own linguistic repertoire, because it has been argued that sometimes it's not so much about how much of a language someone speaks, but what parts of the language. So is it greetings, or is it just numbers, or is it, and I am going to talk about what parts of the language tourists, for example, speak in a second. So basically what I'm showing here for the offline tourist space is communicative practices in space. That's kind of the focus. And this is data from the questionnaires that I distributed among the tourists. And I asked them, so if you meet a Zanzibari, if you meet someone local here, how will you greet them? And these are the answers that they gave. I'm not going to go and talk about all of them, but just some of them. Jumbo is kind of interesting because you can see there are lots of different variants here, probably due to the fact that people usually do not learn Kiswahili in formal instruction, tourists, but rather they somehow pick it up maybe from one of those language guides, or maybe because someone tells them, okay, if you greet someone, then you say Jambo. It is also not really, not proper Swahili. And we're gonna listen to part of an interview with a Zanzibari that I did. So there's something missing there. You actually have to adjust Jambo. Jambo is just the root. You have to adjust it to according who you're speaking to. Is it one person, several people? Are you the first one to greet or the second one? That will become clear in a second when I show you the example. Mambo is also interesting because it's actually very colloquial, meaning it's not really appropriate to use with people who are older than you, of higher status. You could maybe use it with friends, but not really strangers that you meet and you don't know what's the relation between you. I was severely, not yelled at, but I had been in Zanzibar, and then I went back to Dar es Salaam where I was doing field work at the university, and I went to a coffee shop, I think, and I went in and I said Mambo, and they were like, oh no, please go out and come in again and greet me properly. So it's actually, in certain contexts, it's inappropriate. And the last greeting that I would like to point out here is Asante Sana, because it's not a greeting, it actually means thank you. But apparently there are some tourists walking around using this as a greeting. What all of this shows, I guess, in a nutshell, is that informal language learning plays quite an important role for tourists, and they usually do not go to a lot of trouble to learn Swahili. And I don't want to say that they want to be rude. It's just lack of knowledge, I think, very often. Right. And here I would like to play a short excerpt from an interview with one of my participants, who is a tour guide, but also a part-time lecturer in Stone Town. And he explains what he thinks is the origin story of Jambo. The audio is a bit longer than what you can see here. I just tried to put the most important bits on the slide. So let's hope this works.
Yeah, there's, I don't know where it started. There's like, now it's like a formal greeting with the tourists. I don't know where it started, but I think it's something like we find like they cannot pronounce well how we greet. For example, we say, Hujambo, like how are you? Mm-hmm. And then they're difficult for tourists to say also Sijambo. So instead then we use, we cut off some of these, I don't know, critical side. And then say Jambo, and then they say Jambo, so it's easy for them. Yeah, so this kind of language, like very niche, I don't know, Creole or whatever, very small part of our language that we develop for tourists.
Okay, so basically what he's saying is, we find that tourists are not, they can't really pronounce our language very well, so we're kind of simplifying it for them, and then it's easier, because they can all use the same Jambo kind of thing. This is not the explanation that you usually find in the literature. Other people might agree with me. So some people have also told me that this Jambo is also taken from a very popular song that is also very often sung on the island, and that you can find online and everywhere. But I found this interesting because it emphasizes that actually the Zanzibar is kind of it to me it seemed like kind of an act of resistance maybe, or because tourists take over a lot of the space and they dominate with English and everything, but here they're kind of saying, okay, but we made that type of language for them and now they are using it, the simplified form of Swahili. In any case, I thought it's interesting. Now, I focused on greetings because greetings have been argued to be very salient in tourist communication because of their general function of moving people into interactional space. So you have to greet someone in order to start a conversation, right? And that is something that happens very often in tourism and elsewhere as well. But also in tourism, greetings are usually one of the bits and pieces that people pick up of another language. So if you go to Spain, you will probably also try to learn to say hello and goodbye, probably. And looking at spaces then, I could also see that there was a general difference between enclosed spaces and open spaces. Where hotels, bars, restaurants, and so on, especially the more high-end ones, had very strict policies also in terms of how to greet customers that came in. So they had to use English greetings, the staff, with the tourists, adjusted to the time of day. And if a tourist went in and actually tried to use a Swahili greeting, that would be completely ignored and the conversation would continue in English. And at one of the very high-end hotels, they told me, this is the brand standard and we cannot use something else. We have to do it this way. While beyond the greeting in the interaction, then it was often some Kiswahili that came in. Someone said, welcome, karibu in Swahili. That was okay. But the interaction in general then was in English. So that also kind of is indicative of who is wanted in that space and who isn't, maybe, but also in terms of what kind of space they want to create. So what it is supposed to look like, the imaginary of that space, I think. So very structured, very regulated, I'd say. In open spaces, that is a bit different, at least from my observations. So in the streets, but also on the beach, for example, people usually didn't use a greeting, or often didn't use a greeting at all, but just said welcome to kind of, make people come to the souvenir stand or whatever. They might also have used Hakuna Matata, which is probably also a phrase that you all know from pop culture. So it's something that is recognizable and that will also hopefully attract customers. A lot of them would then try different sentences in different European languages to try to determine, okay, are you Spanish? Are you Italian? Something like that. But the interaction itself then in general was also often in English. So I mentioned that in hotels, restaurants, and so on, there were kind of Kiswahili tokens in the so-called linguistic landscape, so language written on things. And this is a menu from a hotel that also had a restaurant. So you would find things like use the word in Kiswahili and translations into English and German, which to me kind of emphasized that this is a performed space that is supposed to be, and I think Swahili here is supposed to enforce authenticity, Africanness, this kind of tourist imaginary of, okay, this is what an African space looks like. You have to have some Kiswahili there. So to summarize the offline space, I don't know how I'm doing times. Okay.
Take your time.
Perfect. I hope I was able to show with this brief glimpse into offline spaces that greetings have representational character because they imply social personae. So you're performing a professional persona if you're a member of staff in a hotel. And similar things have been shown by Nassenstein for tourism in Kenya, where also hotel staff use more formal language because of the professional persona they need to represent. The function of moving interactants into mutual interactional space is emphasized in open spaces, so this kind of pull character of greetings, if you will. But also Swahili is used as a promotional feature in the tourist space. And all of this kind of, to me, entails the question, who is wanted in what spaces? That is somehow expressed communicatively, I think. Now, turning to the online tourist space, here I would rather like to talk about, as opposed to communication in space, communication about space, kind of, so discourse, basically. What you can see here is there's a lot fewer languages in the online space, but this is also usage-based, right? So the other thing was, people told me, they said, I use these languages, but this is really based on what I found, what people use. But it might also be related to the fact that English is still the dominant language online in the world. That is kind of a fact. So most of the data that I actually analyzed is English, with just a few tokens again, and I'm going to show you some in a second. Before that, I would like to say a few words about yoga. And some of you might be more familiar with it, others less. I could probably also guess who here is very likely to have done yoga at some point in their lives and who hasn't, because there's a certain key demographic of people who do yoga, especially in Western societies, even though its roots are very, very different. So roots in India, and also, so I meant, okay, you're probably female, white, and middle class and mid-age, kind of. Then you've probably done yoga at some point in your life, with a few exceptions. Also the other way around. And the thing is also that in India, actually, it's almost 50-50, the demographic of men and women who do yoga. It's very much a Western thing that it's so female-dominated. But so yoga has developed in an interesting way. It has been very much commodified by Western culture for Western popular culture. It's been mentioned in Lander's bestseller titled Stuff White People Like, A Definite Guide to the Unique Taste of Millions. So it's listed there. So that also kind of shows how much it's made its way into pop culture. And it has been called a reappropriated or appropriated indigenous cultural artifact, re-signified by the media for global audiences. I think it has, I don't know, I think it's a bit more, or North America is the biggest market for yoga, according to certain figures. And for me, it was a bit striking. I was in the States last year, and I don't know, maybe Rochelle can tell me if this is also something that she's seen in Baltimore later on. So I toured the East Coast, and at every Walgreens, and, you know, those pharmacy chains, they had a yoga aisle where you could buy yoga apparel or yoga mats or yoga blocks. So that was kind of interesting to me, because I don't think yoga has made that much of an inroads into everyday life in Germany or Europe or Scandinavia, for example. Right. Now, yoga tourism is also very hip, very contemporary, very modern, but also very much commodified. So in general, tourists want to relax when they go on holidays. That is one of the main motivations still for choosing a certain destination. But these days, also lots of tourists are motivated by wanting to find something meaningful, and then mindfulness is also one of the main pull factors. Mindfulness also a somewhat critical concept, sometimes called mindfulness in our contemporary age. So that too has been commodified. And I think in these yoga retreats, specifically that is also very much the case, because there people feel like, okay, you get a combination of pleasure, but also altruistic activities, meaningful experiences, and so on. They hope that yoga tourism is a transformative type of tourism that can lead to self-actualization, and especially yoga retreats are then very popular. Now, looking at some of my data, what I did is I kind of did a thematic analysis. I coded my data, both the text of the advertisements and the pictures, for cultural associations, either associations with Indian and yoga culture or with local culture, which in Zanzibar is kind of split into local culture, Zanzibari culture, and local mainland African culture. And what I found was that there were lots of cultural associations in all the pictures. You can see here that in general references to Indian and yoga culture were made much more in the text as compared to the pictures. For local culture, it's a bit different. Just to show you what I mean by references to Indian and yoga culture, that would be names of yoga styles and schools, such as Ashtanga, Vinyasa, and so on, names of certain postures or poses, related activities, sometimes mentioning Sanskrit, like on a meta level. The instructor also speaks Sanskrit, for example. A lot of the yoga pictures were localized, though, meaning there was some kind of reference to Zanzibar, and by localized, I mean this here is an example. So you see the yoga pose, and then you see a dao boat in the background. So this is definitely Zanzibari, but it's also a reference to yoga in a way. I at some point thought about also mentioning or discussing the types of poses that you can see in the pictures, because I think embodiment plays a huge role in this analysis, but I don't have enough time. So yeah, not today, but I think it's also an interesting thing that one could look at. References to Zanzibari and mainland culture. These are some examples here. So references to architecture on the island, Unguja, references to history, to the general atmosphere of Zanzibar, so an exotic atmosphere, an authentic atmosphere, whatever that means, local lifestyle in general, activities and sightseeing, and so on. And then I put them in bubbles because I felt like, oh yeah, this is like the imaginary that people have of this space. So you can see some references to Zanzibari culture. You can also see, Zanzibaris, but obviously it's white people engaging with their children. So yeah, a bit critical here. And this picture here I find very interesting because it's not in Zanzibar, it's Kilimanjaro. So that definitely kind of links Zanzibar to this general African imaginary. And this is also emphasized here by Safari, the Big Five, and so on in the text. I also looked at the 50 most frequent words in the text in terms of cultural associations with local Zanzibari. Again, I mean, Zanzibar is not very surprising. And town, not either, I guess, sometimes. But safari, as one of the most prominent words, is again surprising, I think, because it's not really related to Zanzibar. So that emphasizes to me that it's a lot about this general imaginary that people have of African destinations, in a way. I have 2 examples, then I have a summary, and then a conclusion. This is just an example of references to Indian and yoga culture in the actual ad, and then references to local culture in the actual ad. So as you can see in the first part, so Ashtanga Vinyasa would be one reference, then pranayama, breath, vinyasa, and so on. And then they also go on to mention a certain yoga school, for example. While references to local culture, referring to traditional building techniques, but then also kite surfing, which is it really part of local culture? It is in the tourist space because lots of tourists do kite surf, but yeah, so a bit critical here. This example is mostly about this aspect of transformative tourism, self-actualization, mindfulness. So this commodified yoga culture is very strong in here. So it says it's one of the most ideal places in the world to come back to yourself. It's one of the best places where you can share the beach with local Zanzibari communities. And then they show a picture like this. So again, white person photographing, like children. And it's also a magical place that will transform you. So I think especially this magical place kind of thing really emphasizes this type of mystification that you find in a lot of tourist texts and in a lot of tourist contexts. Right, I have 2 videos that I also wanted to show, and I hope it's gonna work. So the first one, those are taken from the ads. So some of the advertisements also, besides pictures, feature videos. The first video is kind of this story of tourists come as spectators and see the island, and and I hope.
What's a mouse cut on this?
Yeah. So I think this one mostly emphasizes what I've already said. So a lot of the video is actually dedicated to showing safari tourism, not really related to Zanzibar, really kind of a lot of the pictures, I think, from Zanzibar are also somehow interchangeable, so it could be any kind of tropical location. It doesn't really need to be Zanzibar. Yeah. Where do I have here? The second video that I brought is very, very short, but I think it's also very, very interesting because it kind of emphasizes the complete bubble, the complete yoga bubble. There is no sound. There's also this person who is almost in the dark, and the location really doesn't matter. So I think that could be in almost any location that is somehow a bit tropical, but yeah, to me it really emphasizes the bubble that is somehow created. Right. Coming to the summary of this second part, and then I'm almost done. I hope what I was able to show here is that the transnational flow of yoga online is wide. So especially online, there's digital yoga spaces that are somehow created with elements from commodified yoga culture, but the place itself and references to local culture, they are there. They are not highlighted much in the text. In the pictures, okay, but not so much in the text. And somehow the place becomes a bit interchangeable. So yeah, that's also something that was very obvious in the videos, I think. So is transnationalism, which has sometimes been defined as a hybrid cultural phenomenon, is that really a hybrid cultural phenomenon that we're seeing here, or is it just yoga that is kind of out of space and place? To me, it felt out of place for sure, feels like to me. So retreats seem less grounded in local culture. They form these kinds of bubbles, and that is very much in line with how the tourist space has also been conceptualized sometimes. So the tourist space itself is not the destination, but it's an imaginary space somehow. And I'm wondering whether this is a neo-colonial tendency, because I do have data from Norway, and that looks very different. So yeah. Now I also want to look at Indian data. That would be interesting. So to conclude, I would like to take up the concept of heterotopias again. This picture is a public toilet in Amsterdam. So this is what comes up when you Google heterotopias on Wikipedia. So I also Googled for pictures of heterotopia. Yeah, so they are defined as these kinds of other spaces, worlds within worlds, somehow contradicting everything outside, upsetting what is outside. And Wikipedia thinks that a public toilet in Amsterdam could be a heterotopia. Now I'm wondering whether the spaces that I looked at could be a heterotopia or different heterotopias. So I have spaces, social spaces that are created communicatively and discursively, offline and online. They are clearly targeted at a certain clientele, often excluding the local population. Also place in some of these, as I showed with the yoga ads, does not seem to play a huge role. It's rather all about the tourist experience, about the yoga experience, about the retreat itself. So yoga clearly dominates here. So in that sense, I'm not sure whether these are really transnational spaces. So the four criteria that I took from the definition from Foucault are these spaces enacted utopias. I think they look pretty utopian in some ways. To me, they also look pretty dystopian in other ways, to be honest, because the local population, for example, is excluded, and so on. Is it real places that are represented? I'm not sure what does real even mean. So is tourism not real? It is still part of the local everyday life, but it is some kind of imaginary that is created, and that's why I have problems with, is it real places that are represented? And in that way, I would then also say it's real places that are contested in some way. Are they completely inverted? I'm not sure. If you have ideas, do let me know. Yeah, so these are just a couple of things that I thought of I could be doing in the future. I would like to code the pictures in much more detail, because I think there's way more to get. I mentioned embodiment, I mentioned the postures and so on. So I think that could be very interesting. So I would like to focus on the postures a bit, also on clothing styles and so on, because that has been shown for certain locales also to be kind of a factor in terms of inclusion and exclusion. I would like to compare with my Norwegian and Indian data. Maybe you have other ideas of what I could do, should do, maybe. I would be grateful for any thoughts. And that is it. These are my references if you want a list.